The day Emma Whitaker rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a borrowed mule with 40 cents in her coat pocket and a cast-iron skillet tied to her saddlebag. She had no idea that the most difficult battle she would ever face would be fought at a kitchen table against a 9-year-old boy. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat at the southern edge of Kansas like a rough knot in a rope, the kind of place where the wind never stopped talking and the dust never settled long enough to let you forget how far you were from anything that resembled civilization. The Santa Fe Trail had carved its way through the earth here, and the Kishom Trail ran through like a river of hooves and sweat and ambition, bringing with it longhorn cattle by the thousands, and the men who drove them, men who smelled of leather and campfire, and the particular desperation of someone who had been too long without a roof over his head. Emma had come from Wichita, and before that from a small farm outside of Lawrence, and before that from a life she had dismantled piece by piece after her mother passed in the winter of 1877, and left her nothing but a Bible with pressed wildflowers between the pages and the knowledge that she could cook better than any woman in 3 counties. She was 26 years old and practical in the way that women who had survived genuine hardship tend to be, not hardened exactly, but settled into herself like good timber, the kind that bends without breaking. She had warm brown eyes that people trusted on sight, and hands that were always doing something useful, and a way of moving through a room that made the room feel more inhabited than it had before she arrived. She had answered an advertisement in the Wichita Beacon, the same paper she had used to line her windowsills against the winter drafts. The advertisement had been brief and businesslike and had said, in its entirety, "Housekeeper wanted, Caldwell, Kansas. Maddox Ranch south of town, 2 miles on the Kishom Road. Good wages for a capable woman. Inquire in person. No correspondence." She had read it twice, then a third time. Then she had folded it and put it in her coat pocket where it stayed for 3 days before she made up her mind. She was not a woman who made decisions impulsively. She thought things through the way you worked through a difficult seam in a piece of leather slowly, with steady pressure, until something gave way and the right shape emerged. By the time she borrowed Martha Alcott's mule and set off down the road toward Caldwell, she had convinced herself that this was simply a practical arrangement, a matter of exchanging her considerable talent in a kitchen for wages and shelter, and there was no reason to attach any further expectation to it. She had not accounted for Luke Maddox. The ranch was not what she expected. She had imagined something rough-hewn and provisional, the kind of homestead that looked like a man had thrown it up in a hurry and never quite gotten around to finishing it. Instead, what she found was a property that had clearly been built with intention and care, though something had gone wrong with the care somewhere along the way. The house was solid, 2 stories of good timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side, and there were outbuildings, a barn, a smokehouse, a smaller structure that might have been a bunkhouse, all of them well constructed but wearing the particular neglect of a place where the people living in it had stopped noticing what needed doing. The fence posts along the yard needed whitewashing. The kitchen garden had gone to weeds. The curtains in the lower windows were faded to the color of old cream. A man was mending a section of fence at the far side of the yard when she rode up, and he did not look up for a long moment, which gave her the opportunity to observe him before he observed her. He was tall and lean in the particular way of men who worked with their bodies every day, all the softness burned out of him by sun and labor, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and hands that were working at the fence wire with an efficiency that spoke of doing the same task many times before. He wore a work shirt the color of slate and trousers that had been patched at the left knee, and there was a hat pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had pushed it back while thinking and forgotten to push it forward again. When he finally looked up, she saw that he was perhaps 32 or 33, with a face that had been weathered by the plain sun into something honest and angular, and eyes that were a shade of gray-green that she did not have a ready word for. He looked at her without expression for a moment, and then something in his face shifted into cautious attention, the way a man looks when he has been expecting something and is not entirely sure the thing that has arrived is what he expected. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "That is correct," she said. "I am Emma Whitaker. I have come about the housekeeper position." He set down the fence wire and pulled off his work gloves and walked across the yard toward her, and she dismounted from the mule with the kind of practiced efficiency that told him she had been on and off horses and mules more times in her life than she could count. He stopped a few feet from her and seemed to take her in not in an impolite way, but in the careful manner of a man making an assessment he knew would have consequences. "Luke Maddox," he said, and put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm but not performative, the kind of handshake that means what it says without trying to say more than it means. "You rode from Wichita alone?" he asked. "I did," she said. "That is a fair stretch of road." "I am capable of managing a fair stretch of road," she said, not unkindly, but plainly. "I would think that is exactly the kind of information you need about someone applying to work for you." Something moved in his expression that might have been the very beginning of a smile. "I suppose it is," he said. "Come on up to the porch. I will show you what needs doing." What needed doing, it turned out, was almost everything. The inside of the house was clean enough in a functional sense. The floors swept, the dishes washed, but there was a hollowness to it, a quality of barely maintained order that spoke of a man doing the minimum necessary to keep things from falling apart, with no energy left over for the kind of care that makes a house feel like people are glad to be inside it. The kitchen was large and had a good iron stove and adequate stores, but the shelves were disorganized, and the pantry held only the most rudimentary provisions. The parlor had good furniture that had not been dusted properly in some time. There were no flowers, no curtains that were not faded, no small evidence that beauty had been considered. Luke Maddox walked her through it all in a few direct sentences, and she listened without comment until he had finished. "The wages?" she asked. $12 a month," he said, "and your room and board. The room is upstairs, the smaller one at the end of the hall. It has a window that faces east." "That is acceptable," she said. "When would you need me to begin?" "You could begin today," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him steadily. "I am willing," she said, "but I will need to know something first." She looked around the kitchen, at the neat enough shelves and the stove and the single coffee cup sitting on the table that had clearly been there since morning and not moved. "You mentioned in the advertisement that this is for a housekeeper, not a cook, but there is clearly a kitchen here that has not been used to its full potential. Am I being hired to cook as well?" "Yes," he said, and something in the plainness of that single word carried a weight she did not yet have the context to understand. "And who will I be cooking for?" He was quiet for a moment. "For myself," he said, "and for my son." It was the first mention of the boy. His name was Caleb, and she did not see him that first day, though she felt his presence in the house the way you feel the presence of a storm that is gathering somewhere just beyond the horizon, in small atmospheric signs, in the tension of the man she had gone to work for, in the tiny evidence around her of a child's life being lived in these rooms. There were small boots by the back door, worn at the toes. There was a carved wooden horse on the windowsill of the parlor that someone had left exactly so, as though it had been placed with care and must not be moved. There was a child's drawing tacked to the wall near the back staircase, a horse and a man, and what she took to be a son, rendered in the earnest and slightly lopsided style of a young child who is drawing from memory and feeling rather than observation. Luke had told her simply that Caleb was 9 years old and that he was with the ranch hand, old Jerry Briggs, for the afternoon, helping sort some stock. He said this in the same tone he used for everything else, direct, without embellishment, the tone of a man who had learned to deliver information without inviting questions about it. Emma had accepted this and set about making herself useful in the kitchen, putting the stores in order and taking stock of what was there and what was needed. And by the time she heard boots on the porch steps and the back door open, she had a pot of beef soup on the stove that filled the kitchen with a smell so warm and specific and undeniably good that it was its own kind of announcement. The boy stopped in the doorway. She turned to look at him, and the first thing she noticed was how much he looked like his father. The same angular face, the same straight set of the jaw, the same gray-green eyes that watched her with an assessment that was, in its serious 9-year-old way, exactly as measured and careful as his father's had been. He was slight for his age, with dark hair that was overlong and perpetually disheveled, and he was wearing a shirt that had a button missing at the second buttonhole, which she noted without saying anything. He stared at her. She smiled at him, neither too eagerly nor too cautiously. "You must be Caleb," she said. "I am Miss Whitaker. Your father has hired me to keep the house and cook." He did not say anything. He looked at the pot on the stove and then back at her and then at the pot again. "Soup will be ready in about 20 minutes, she said pleasantly, and turned back to stir it. She heard him move through the kitchen and go up the back stairs, and she heard no further sound from him until Luke came in from the yard and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the kitchen table. Emma ladled soup into 2 bowls and set one in front of Luke and went back to ladle a third for herself. And when she turned around, she saw Luke looking at the empty chair where a third bowl might logically go, and the shadow that moved across his face when he understood that the third bowl was intended for her and not for his son. "He does not eat with strangers," Luke said quietly. Emma set her own bowl down across from his. "He does not know me yet," she said, just as quietly. "That is a different thing." Luke looked at her for a moment and then looked down at his soup. "You may find it is not so different to him," he said. She did not argue with that. She sat down and they ate in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. 2 practical people in a kitchen, establishing the quiet geography of a shared space. And the soup was, as she had known it would be, very good. Luke Maddox ate 2 full bowls of it without saying so, but with the focused attention of a man who had been eating only adequate food for too long, and had almost forgotten that food could be something you wanted rather than something you required. When they had finished, she collected the bowls and said, "I will take a plate up to him." "You do not need to do that," Luke said quickly, and something in his voice had an edge to it that was not irritation exactly but more like a well-worn grief dressed up as practicality. "He will come down when he is hungry enough." Emma considered this. "He is 9, she said. "He should eat a proper supper." "I know he should," Luke said, and the way he said it closed the subject so completely that she let it close. There would be time to understand what had happened here. She had only been in this house for a few hours. She was patient. She had always been patient in the particular way of people who believe that the right kind of attention, applied consistently, will eventually get through to whatever is hiding behind a wall. She would learn, over the following days, the shape of the grief that lived in this house. She would learn it not through any single revelation but through accumulation, through the way Luke never spoke of Caleb's mother unprompted, and through the way Caleb went quiet and rigid when something reminded him of her, and through the small evidence she found gradually as she cleaned and organized and put the house back to rights. A woman's good Sunday dress at the back of the wardrobe, still folded in its original careful way. A pair of women's gloves on the shelf in the parlor, behind the books. A photograph in a small frame on the mantelpiece that showed a younger Luke and a young woman with dark hair and a gentle expression, standing in front of this very house with the look of people who have just built something they intend to keep. Her name had been Me. Emma learned this from Jerry Briggs, the ranch hand, who was an old man from Missouri with a face like worn leather and eyes that were still, behind the weathering, kind. Jerry had been with Luke since before Luke bought the ranch, and he spoke of Me with the respectful directness of someone who had genuinely liked her and did not feel the need to talk around what was real. She had died in the winter of 1876 of pneumonia that came on fast and did not give her the chance to fight it properly. Caleb had been 7. Luke had been 31. It broke something in that boy, Jerry said one afternoon when Emma was outside hanging wash and Jerry was repairing a harness nearby. "Not the breaking kind where you can see the crack. The other kind, where it goes down deep and changes the shape of things without making much noise about it." He paused and pulled at a strap. He was a talking child before, always going on about something. After, he just stopped filling the room up the way he used to. Emma listened to all of this and thought about it as she cooked. She was not a woman who rushed toward the broken places in people with dramatic gestures. She knew that the broken places in children especially needed to be approached from the side, gradually and without announcement, the way you approach a wild thing that has learned to distrust the direct approach of human hands. What she could do, what she knew how to do better than almost anything, was cook. And she believed not as a romantic notion but as a practical truth she had arrived at through experience, that there was a kind of safety in a well-made meal that went deeper than hunger. A good meal said, someone was paying attention. Someone knew what you needed before you said it. Someone was here. So she cooked. She cooked as she had never cooked in her life, or at least she cooked as she had never been given the latitude to cook before, because here she had a good stove and adequate provisions and the freedom to make of it what she could. She made corn bread that came out with a crust that crumbled at the edges and a center that was tender and faintly sweet. And she made slow-braised beef that fell apart at the touch of a fork and filled the whole downstairs with an aroma that was almost physical in its warmth. And she made apple preserves from the last of the winter stock she found in the cellar and put them up in proper jars on the pantry shelf where they caught the light and glowed amber. She made biscuits in the mornings that were the exact right texture, not too dense, not too airy, and she made bean soup with salt pork, and she made roasted chicken on Sundays with herbs she found dried in the pantry and revived with care. Caleb never came to the table. He would appear in the kitchen doorway at mealtimes and look at the food and look at Emma and then disappear upstairs, and she would hear from Luke, who went up to him each evening with a plate, that the boy had eaten. He was eating. He was simply not eating with her in the room. "He is the same," Luke told her at the end of her first week, not unkindly but with the weight of a man reporting a fact he has long since accepted. "I do not want you to take it as a comment on your cooking. It is not about the cooking." "I know it is not about the cooking," Emma said. "It is about trust, and trust takes time. I am not in a hurry." Luke looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something that surprised him by being exactly what was needed and no more. He had, she had noticed, a particular wariness around things that approached his feelings directly, the way a man who has been burned approaches an open flame with reasonable caution. But she was not trying to approach his feelings. She was just trying to do her job, and the job, she had decided, included more than it had said in the advertisement. By the second week she had organized the house into something that functioned not just adequately but actually well, and she had set the kitchen garden to rights. The weeds pulled, the beds turned over, seeds going in for the spring planting. She had replaced the faded curtains in the parlor with ones she found in a cedar chest upstairs, a deep blue-green that changed the quality of the afternoon light entirely and made the room look inhabited by people who cared about it. She had polished the furniture and beat the rugs and repaired, with needle and thread she had brought in her saddlebag, the missing button on Caleb's shirt, leaving it folded on the chair in his room without comment. She found him looking at her one morning from the top of the stairs while she was working in the hallway below. She did not look up immediately, finished what she was doing, and then looked up and said, "Good morning, Caleb." He did not answer, but he did not disappear either. He stood at the top of the stairs and regarded her with those gray-green eyes for a long moment, and then went back to his room. She took this as progress. The progress with Luke was of a different kind and moved by its own rhythms, slower in some ways and faster in others, and she was not always sure what to make of it. He was a man who expressed things in actions rather than words. She could see this clearly, and the actions were beginning to say something. He started appearing in the kitchen in the evenings after supper was cleared, nominally to check the stove or get water, but actually, she suspected, because the kitchen was where she was, and the kitchen had become the most alive room in the house, and something in him was drawn to that aliveness. The way a cold man is drawn to a fire he does not want to admit he needs. They talked in those evenings, haltingly at first, and then with an increasing ease that she tried not to examine too closely, because examining it felt like tempting something. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle he ran and the difficulties of the season, and a deal he was considering with a rancher to the east whose land bordered his own. She told him about Wichita and about the farm outside Lawrence and about her mother, not the grief of losing her but the specific texture of who she had been, the way she made coffee too strong and sang hymns slightly off-key while she worked and knew the name of every person in the county and what they needed before they knew it themselves. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Luke said. "She was," Emma said. "She was exactly that." There was a silence, and then he said, without looking at her directly, "Me was like that too. She knew everyone and what they needed." He paused. "Caleb has that quality from her, or he did before." Emma did not say anything immediately. She folded the dish towel she had been holding and set it on the counter with care. "He still has it," she said finally. "You can see it in the way he watches things. He is taking everything in. He has just stopped feeling safe enough to do anything with what he sees." Luke was quiet for a long time after that. She was lying awake one night in her east-facing room at the end of the hall, listening to the sounds of the Kansas night, the wind that never quite stopped, the occasional low sound from the direction of the barn, the creak of the house settling, when she heard the small sound from down the hall. A child's cough, and then a stillness, and then the sound of small feet on the floorboards. She listened. The feet went past her door toward the stairs, and she heard the careful step-by-step descent of a child trying not to wake anyone, and then silence from the lower floor. She lay still for a moment and then got up and put on her wrapper and went quietly down the stairs. Caleb was in the kitchen. He had lit the small lamp on the table, and he was standing in front of the cold stove with the look of a boy who has come downstairs in the night for something, and has found himself not quite knowing how to get it. He was in his nightshirt, and his hair was flattened on one side from sleep, and he looked, in the lamplight, very young and very much a child who had been 9 years old for only a few months, and was carrying something far too heavy for his age. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, and his face went immediately to that closed, watchful expression she was becoming familiar with, the one that said he was deciding whether to bolt or hold his ground. She came into the kitchen without hurrying and without making a project of his presence there. She went to the stove and knelt to open the fire door and coax the coals back to something useful, and she said, "I could not sleep either. The wind is loud tonight." He watched her. She got the stove going and put the small kettle on. "I make warm milk sometimes when I cannot sleep," she said, still without looking at him directly. "My mother used to make it with a little honey. I found honey in the cellar." "The good kind, dark." She paused. "You could have some if you wanted." He did not say yes, but he did not leave. She made the warm milk and set one cup on the table with the honey beside it and made no further comment about it, and went to the pantry to do something purposeful there while he decided what to do. She heard, after a moment, the scrape of the chair, and then silence, which she took to be the silence of a boy drinking warm milk in the middle of the night and finding that it was good. When she came back to the kitchen, the cup was empty and he was gone. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment with the lamp burning and the stove warming the room and the wind doing its plains business outside, and she felt something that was not quite joy and not quite hope, but was in the family of both, a quiet kind of certainty that things were moving in the right direction, slowly and in their own time. In the morning she found Caleb's carved wooden horse moved from the parlor windowsill to the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light came through. She did not touch it. She cooked breakfast eggs from the hens out back, fried in a pan with good butter, and biscuits with the honey from the cellar, and Luke came in from the yard and sat down, and she poured his coffee, and he looked at the carved horse on the windowsill and looked at her, and she gave him nothing with her expression except an ordinary morning pleasantness, and he looked back at his coffee and drank it. The town of Caldwell was, like most cattle towns on the Kishom Trail, a particular kind of place, practical and rough at its core, with saloons and livestock pens and hardware stores doing the fundamental business of a trail town, but also with the beginnings of a more settled life pushing up around the edges, the way grass pushes up around the edge of a building when nobody is pulling it back. There was a church and a schoolhouse and a dry goods store run by a woman named Mrs. Paulson, who knew everything that happened in town within hours of it happening, and who looked at Emma the first time she came in for provisions with the frank and estimating gaze of a woman assembling a picture from the available evidence. "You are Luke Maddox's new housekeeper," Mrs. Paulson said. It was not a question. "I am," Emma said. "He is a good man," Mrs. Paulson said, with the particular emphasis of a woman who means more than the words she has chosen. "He has had a difficult time of it." "Both of them have." "I expect they have," Emma said, and paid for her provisions and said good morning and went back to the buckboard without providing any further information, which she suspected pleased Mrs. Paulson almost as much as gossip would have, because it gave her something to speculate about. The first Saturday in May, Luke drove Emma into town for provisions with Caleb in the back of the buckboard, and this was notable because it was the first time Caleb had been in the same moving space as Emma for longer than a few minutes, and because Caleb sat in the back with the particular self-conscious stiffness of a boy who has made a decision to endure something and intends to carry it out with dignity. Emma sat on the bench beside Luke and looked at the road and the sky and the flat Kansas horizon, and said pleasant things about the weather and the state of the road and the early wildflowers that were coming up in the ditches, and did not once turn around to address Caleb directly. At the store, Caleb stayed close to his father while Emma consulted with Mrs. Paulson about provisions, and it was while she was examining the dried beans that she heard from the far end of the store Caleb's voice, which she had never heard directly addressed to her, and which was, when deployed, a clear, serious, slightly rusty voice, the voice of a child who has been speaking mostly to one person for 2 years. He was not addressing her. He was addressing his father in a low voice that was not quite low enough. "She knows what kind of beans to get," Caleb said. Emma did not turn around. She continued examining the beans with the same focused attention she had been giving them a moment before. "She does," Luke said, and she could hear the careful neutrality in his voice, the deliberate lack of pressure. "She does know." There was a pause, and then Caleb said nothing more, and Emma picked out the beans she wanted and moved on to the flour. And when they drove home in the afternoon with the buckboard full, Caleb sat in the back in a different kind of silence than the one he had maintained on the way in, not the stiff silence of endurance, but the softer silence of a boy who is thinking about something and has not decided yet what to do about it. On the first warm evening of the month, Luke Maddox did something that caught Emma completely off guard, which was remarkable because she prided herself on being difficult to catch off guard. She was on the porch after supper, sitting with the mending basket in the last of the evening light, and he came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her on the railing and sat down in the other chair with the careful deliberateness of a man making a choice that he has thought about and is committing to. They sat for a while in the particular quiet of a Kansas evening, when the wind softens and the light goes amber and everything on the plains takes on a quality of held breath before the dark comes in. "I want to say something," Luke said eventually. Emma looked at him. The amber light did things to the planes of his face that she had been trying not to notice and was finding increasingly difficult not to notice. "This house," he said carefully, "has not felt like what it used to feel like since me died. I had gotten used to that, to it being a different kind of thing, just a place to sleep and keep warm." He was looking at the horizon and not at her, which was how he delivered the things that mattered. "It feels different now. It feels like what it was." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I am glad," she said simply. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am grateful, and that he paused, and the pause was the kind that costs something, that it is not only gratitude." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the quality of that exchange was different from any of the ones before it, not practically, not professionally, but as two people who are standing in a threshold of something and both know it and neither has quite yet stepped through. "I know it is not," she said softly. He nodded once, and they both went back to looking at the horizon, and the evening came down around them in the slow and gentle way of a Kansas spring evening, and the coffee was good, and neither of them said anything more, which was enough. The morning of the second Saturday in May, Emma was making a particularly ambitious breakfast flapjacks with the last of the maple syrup she had ordered from Mrs. Paulson's store and had been saving for the right occasion, and thick-cut bacon from the smokehouse, and eggs done the way she had learned that Luke preferred them, which was with the yolk still soft. She was at the stove and the kitchen was warm with cooking, and the good maple smell was filling the whole lower floor, and she heard footsteps on the back stairs. 2 sets. Luke came in first, already dressed, and took his usual seat and poured his own coffee because by now he knew where everything was and she had arranged it so that the things he reached for most were exactly where he would reach. And then the back stairs gave up their second occupant, and Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the flapjacks on the stove and at the maple syrup in its small pitcher on the table and at the plate that Emma had set not specifically for him, just set, as she always set the table for 3, with the same hope she applied to it every morning, and something in his face shifted. It was a very small shift. It was barely visible, but she saw it. He walked to the table. He pulled out the chair, the one that faced the window, the one beside his father's, and he sat down in it. Emma turned back to the stove and flipped the flapjacks with total composure, as though nothing particular had happened, though her heart was doing something she could feel all the way to her fingertips. She got the bacon off the iron and arranged it on the platter and brought the flapjacks to the table and set the platter down and took her own seat, and Luke was looking at his coffee cup with the studied attention of a man who does not want to look at the thing that is happening for fear of breaking it, and Caleb was looking at the flapjacks. "The maple syrup is good," Emma said pleasantly, and put the small pitcher within his reach. "Mrs. Paulson had it shipped from Missouri. Real maple, not the imitation kind." Caleb looked at the pitcher, then he reached out and took it. He poured syrup on his flapjacks with the focused gravity of a 9-year-old giving a task its full attention, and he picked up his fork, and he ate. Nobody made a remark. Nobody noted the occasion or commented on the milestone or looked at anyone else for longer than was normal. They ate their flapjacks and their bacon, and the kitchen held the 3 of them in its warm, maple-smelling morning light. And outside the Kansas spring was going about its business in the usual way. And from the barn came the occasional sound of the horses, and somewhere far off a meadowlark was singing in the new grass. And it was, Emma thought, about as close to a perfect morning as she had encountered in her 26 years. After breakfast, while she was clearing, Luke went out to the yard, and a moment later she heard the back door open again, and she thought he had come back for something he had forgotten. But it was not Luke. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her. Just looking in his serious, measuring way. She stacked the plates and waited. "The flapjacks were good," he said. His voice was rusty from disuse in her direction, but clear and genuine, and the words cost him something. She could see that in the slight effort of them, but he delivered them squarely, the way his father delivered things, without flinching. "Thank you," she said, equally squarely. "I will make them again sometime." He nodded once and went back through the door, and she heard his boots on the porch steps going in the direction of the barn, where his father would be. And she stood very still in the kitchen for a moment with a plate in each hand, and felt the solid, clean happiness of something built one careful piece at a time, finally beginning to hold its shape. The summer came on fast and hot, the way summers in Kansas do, all at once and without negotiation, the sky going from spring blue to a white bleached height that pressed down on the plains with the weight of a continent of heat. The cattle were out on the summer range, and Luke and Jerry, and the two cowboys Luke hired for the season, a young man named Eli from Texas, and a taciturn Ohioan named Frank, were moving between the ranch and the range in the rhythm that the season demanded. And Emma ran the house and the kitchen garden, and did the 1,000 things that kept a working ranch from dissolving back into raw land. She and Caleb had arrived at a careful, budding friendship, the kind that had a great deal of space in it, because both of them were people who required space. He would sometimes appear in the kitchen while she was cooking and sit at the table with a book or a piece of wood he was carving, and say nothing for long stretches, and she would say nothing either, and this mutual silence was comfortable in a way that felt, she thought, like respect. She had begun asking him questions, not the patronizing, pumping questions that adults deploy at children they are trying to engage, but actual questions about things she genuinely needed to know or wanted his opinion on, about where the best fishing in the creek was, and whether he thought the kitchen garden needed more water, and what he thought the weather was going to do. He always answered with the same directness as his father, and she found, as she had suspected she would, that behind the watchfulness was a boy of considerable intelligence and surprising humor, dry and unexpected, the kind that catches you off guard and makes you laugh before you have decided to. He laughed at her laughing at him, with a ducked head and a small, reluctant smile that was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time, not because it was particularly extraordinary in itself, but because of everything it had cost to get here. Luke saw the friendship developing and said nothing directly, but expressed his response in the way he expressed everything through action, through an increasing warmth in how he moved around her, through small attentions that accumulated into something she could not pretend not to feel. He fixed the squeaking step on the back porch without being asked, because she had mentioned once, in passing, that it startled her when she went out early in the mornings. He brought in wildflowers once in late June, a handful of the yellow ones that grew at the far end of the property, and set them on the kitchen table without comment, and when she looked at him over them, he was already on his way back to the door, but the back of his neck, she noticed, was faintly red. She put the wildflowers in a jar with water and set them on the parlor table where the light from the new curtains fell across them, and they stayed there until they were gone. There was an afternoon in early July, hot and brilliant, when she walked out to the kitchen garden to bring in some tomatoes and found Luke there already, crouching over a row that had been giving her trouble with some kind of root pest, doing something to the soil with a tool she hadn't seen used in the garden before. He looked up when he heard her, and his expression had that quality she was learning to read, slightly caught out, but not embarrassed, the expression of a man who has been found doing something kind and is not entirely sure how to wear it. "What are you doing?" she asked. "There is something wrong with this row," he said. "I know what it is. Had the same problem down at the south end 2 summers ago. You need to turn the soil and put in some ash from the stove." She looked at the row and then at him. "Have you been looking at my garden?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that was not quite teasing but was in the same neighborhood. "It is my garden too," he said, but the corner of his mouth moved. "It is," she agreed. "It is your garden too." She crouched down beside him and looked at the soil where he was working, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him alongside the warmth of the day, and they both looked at the garden for a moment without looking at each other. And then he said quietly, in a voice pitched just for the two of them and the summer air between them, "Emma." She looked at him. He was looking at her now, and the gray-green of his eyes was very clear in the strong July light, and there was something in his expression that had put the practical man entirely aside and left only the person underneath, the one who had been through something enormous and was still standing on the other side of it, and was looking at her with the careful, honest vulnerability of someone who has decided to be seen. "I should tell you," he said, "what I think. Not because I have any right to expect anything from you, but because it is not honest to go on not saying it." He paused and gathered himself in that way of his, the slight squaring of the shoulders. "I think you are the finest person I have known in a long time. I think you coming here was the best thing that has happened to this house and to my son in 2 years. And I think I know that what I feel for you is more than gratitude, more than respect." Another pause longer. "I am not asking anything from you. I know you came here to work and not to—" He stopped. "Luke," she said. He looked at her. "I know what you are trying to say," she said. "And I want you to know that what I feel is—" She looked down at the garden soil for a moment and then back at him. "It is not at all one-sided." The silence that followed was not empty but full, the way a room is full when the right person walks into it. He reached over slowly and with care and took her hand where it rested on her knee and held it for a moment in his large, work-worn one, and she felt the warmth of that grip all the way through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the July sun. "Then," he said, "perhaps we can talk about what that means, when you are ready, when the time is right." "I think," she said, "that I am ready to talk about it now." He looked at her and the smallest, most genuine smile she had ever seen on a human face broke through all his careful guardedness, and she thought, there he is. That is the man under all the weather of the past 2 years. There he is. They stayed in the garden for another half-hour, working side by side on the difficult row, and talked while they worked, not about feelings, which had been said and heard and did not need to be said more, but about ordinary things, the ranch and the season and what she planned to put in for fall planting. And this too was a kind of intimacy, the kind that is rooted in ordinary life and therefore lasts. That evening at supper, Caleb looked between them with those sharp observing eyes and said nothing, but afterward, when Emma was washing up, he appeared at her elbow with a dish towel, which was an entirely unprecedented event, and began drying the dishes she handed him without being asked. They worked in companionable quiet for several minutes, and then he said without preamble, "My father smiles more now." Emma handed him a bowl and kept her eyes on the wash basin. "Does he?" she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "He did not used to, not since Mama died." A pause. "I think that is good." "I think so too," Emma said. "You can call me Cal," he said then, with the offhand delivery of someone presenting a significant gift wrapped up to look like nothing. "Jerry calls me Cal. My mother called me Cal." Emma felt something shift very quietly and very completely in the vicinity of her heart. "Thank you, Cal," she said. "I will do that." He nodded, finished the last of the drying, set the towel on the counter, and went outside to the porch with the carved wooden horse in his hands, which was what he did in the evenings when the day's work was done, and the night had not yet fully arrived. She watched him through the kitchen window, sitting on the porch steps in the purple evening light, and felt something she did not have a name for, something that was love in a broader sense than she had expected to feel in this place. The question of what happened next between herself and Luke unfolded over the following weeks in the way of things that are being done right with patience and honesty, and a good deal of the kind of conversation that happens in kitchens and on porches at dusk, and while driving a buckboard into town, the kind that builds the real knowledge of another person. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri when he was 23 with enough money for the land and almost nothing left over, and that the first 3 years of the ranch had been brutal in the way that first years on new land always are. She learned that he could not carry a tune to save his life, a fact that he admitted with a complete lack of self-consciousness that made her laugh for a long time. She learned that he read when he could, that there was a small but real collection of books in the parlor that he had assembled over the years, that he had strong opinions about the management of cattle and equally strong opinions about the management of people, which he kept mostly to himself. She learned that he had been, before the weight of grief pressed it down, a man with genuine warmth and humor, and she watched both of these things come back into the light over the course of the summer like plants, turning toward the sun they had been starved of. He learned things about her too, that she was afraid of almost nothing except the particular helplessness of watching someone she cared about in pain and being unable to do anything about it, which was what her mother's final weeks had been. that she could identify almost any bird by its call, a skill she had developed as a child lying in the grass of the Lawrence farm with nothing to do but listen. That she had never once in her life done things by halves, which was either a virtue or a difficulty, depending on the situation. That she had a temper, though she kept it well contained, and when it surfaced it was honest and direct and passed quickly, without lingering damage, which he respected enormously. In August, on a Sunday after church, they had started attending together, the three of them, which the town of Caldwell had noted with the particular interested attention that small towns bring to this kind of development. Luke stopped the buckboard at the edge of the property and turned to her with the same straightforward quality he brought to everything important and said, "I would like to ask if you would consider being my wife, Emma. I know this is forward. I know we have not known each other for very long, but I know what I know, and I know it does not require more time." He paused. "And Cal agrees in case that matters to you." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Behind them, from the back of the buckboard, she heard a sound that was Caleb very deliberately looking in the other direction and pretending to be entirely occupied with something on the horizon. "It matters to me enormously," she said. "It may be the thing that matters most." "Then will you?" He asked. "Yes," she said. "Luke Maddox, yes, I will." He exhaled as though he had been holding his breath, which she realized he probably had been, and then he took her hand in both of his and held it with the same careful strength with which he held most of the things that were important to him. And from the back of the buckboard Caleb said, in his clear, serious, rusty voice, "Good," and then went back to whatever it was he was pretending to look at on the horizon. Emma turned and looked at him, and he met her eyes with a face that was doing several things at once, trying not to smile, trying to look as though he had not been paying attention, failing at both. And she reached back over the bench and held out her hand, and after a moment he took it and squeezed it once. And that was the thing, she thought later, that sealed everything that needed sealing. They married in September, in the small Caldwell church, on a day when the Kansas sky was its particular fall blue, and the air had the first clean chill of the season in it. Emma wore a dove-gray dress that she had made herself in the evenings during August from fabric she and Mrs. Paulson had selected together, and it was simple and well-made and fit her exactly right. And she carried wild asters that Jerry Briggs had found somewhere and presented to her that morning with a formality that made her want to cry, which she declined to do because she was a practical woman, and there was a day to get through. Luke wore his good suit, which she had pressed for him the night before, and he was waiting at the front of the church with Jerry beside him, who was serving as his best man, and was wearing an expression of determined dignity that was undone slightly by the fact that he had a piece of hay in his hatband that nobody had told him about. Caleb sat in the front pew in his good shirt, fully buttoned, and watched the proceedings with the focused attention of a boy for whom this is an important event and not a sentimental one. And Emma walked up the aisle with the knowledge that both of them were watching her, and that this was exactly right and exactly what she wanted. The minister spoke the words and they spoke the words back, and Luke looked at her in the way he looked at things that mattered, straight and clear, without flinching from it. And when they were pronounced husband and wife, and he kissed her in the gentle but certain way of a man who has made up his mind about something and is not conflicted about the making of it, the small church erupted into what the town of Caldwell could produce by way of celebration, which turned out to be quite a lot. Mrs. Paulson had organized a wedding supper in the church hall with the determined efficiency of a woman who has decided that the community needs something to celebrate and intends to provide it. And there was roasted chicken and good bread, and a cake that Emma herself had made the day before, which was a honey cake with dried fruit, dense and golden, and exactly the kind of cake that a wedding in the middle of the Kansas prairie should have. Caleb ate 2 pieces of cake and reported this fact to Emma with the slight surprise of someone who has exceeded his own expectations, and she cut him a 3rd piece, and he accepted it without argument, which was also progress. They drove home in the evening under a sky going purple and gold, the three of them on the buckboard bench, Caleb between them with the particular dignity of a child who has been given a grown-up position and intends to carry it properly. And the house, when they pulled up to it, was lit in the windows with the lamps that Jerry had left burning. And it looked, Emma thought, exactly like a house where people lived who were glad to be in it. The fall settled over the Maddox ranch, with the particular richness of a season that has something to prove. Emma put the kitchen garden to bed for the winter and put up preserves and stored vegetables in the cellar, and made the house as tight against the coming cold as she knew how to make it. She cooked through the fall with the pleasure of a woman who has a kitchen and a family, and nothing preventing her from doing exactly what she does best. And the smells of those fall months, cinnamon and apple and roasting meat, and the particular warm bread smell of a kitchen where the stove is always going, worked their way into the fabric of the house until they were simply what the house smelled like, which was the smell of being home. Caleb had started school in September, attending the Caldwell schoolhouse with a group of 8 other children under the instruction of a young teacher named Miss Holt, who was new to Kansas and had the slightly dazed air of someone who has not yet decided whether the frontier agrees with her. He went without complaint and came home each afternoon with his school reader and a series of observations about the other children that he delivered at the dinner table with the even-handed analytical quality of a natural scholar. He liked arithmetic and was indifferent to reading instruction because he already read better than most of the class, and he liked Miss Holt, whom he judged to be smart but cold, an assessment that Emma thought was probably accurate. He had also, somewhere in the course of the fall, arrived at something in his relationship with Emma that neither of them had named and did not need to name. She was not his mother, and he knew it, and she knew it. And me was in this house still, in the good Sunday dress in the wardrobe, in the photograph on the mantelpiece, in the stories that Jerry told and that Luke sometimes told in the evenings when the fire was going, and Caleb leaned against his father's arm in the comfortable way of a child who has finally found his comfortable position. And Emma had never once suggested otherwise or tried to occupy the space that me occupied. What she occupied was her own space, which was different and new, and she was making it carefully, every day, out of maple syrup and warm milk in the night and buttons sewn back on, and gardens put to rights and someone being there when the kitchen got cold. In November, Luke came in from the yard on a gray afternoon when Emma was making bread and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with the look of a man who is steeling himself for something, and she turned to look at him with flour on her hands and waited. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, "about the eastern property. The rancher I told you about, Haverson. He is selling the land and I have the opportunity to buy it. It would double the size of this place. It would mean a difficult year or two financially. Tight." He paused. "I wanted to tell you rather than decide without you." Emma looked at him. She thought about it for a moment in the real and serious way she thought about things. "Is it good land?" she asked. "It is very good land," he said, "and the cattle operation would be viable on the larger scale. More than viable," he said. "It would be strong." "Then you should buy it," she said, and went back to her bread. He stood in the doorway for another moment. "You are not worried about the tight years?" "I grew up on 40 acres of difficult land with a mother and no father, and we managed," she said, working the bread dough with steady hands. "2 tight years with a good operation underneath them is nothing I cannot handle." He crossed the kitchen in a few strides and turned her around from the bread bowl and kissed her, which was something he did more readily now, with the increasing ease of a man who has stopped being careful about showing what he feels. She kissed him back with equal directness, getting flour on his shirt, and they stood in the warm kitchen for a moment with the bread smell around them and the November wind doing its work outside. "You are extraordinary," he said, with the same plain quality he brought to compliments, which made them land with a weight that embellished versions would not have. "I am practical," she said, and picked up a towel and cleaned her hands and went back to the bread, and he went back out to the yard, and the farm and the future and the two of them in it felt in that moment more solid than anything she had ever built. The Haverson land was purchased before the end of the year, the papers signed in the Caldwell land office in December with Luke's steady hand and the rancher's reluctant one, and they drove home through a light snowfall that was the first of the season, and Caleb, who had come with them, put his hand out the side of the buckboard to catch snowflakes and commented on them with the precise, interested attention he brought to things he found genuinely remarkable. "Each one is different," he said. "That is what they say," Luke agreed. "I read that in the school reader," Caleb said. "I was not sure I believed it." "Do you believe it now?" Emma asked. He looked at his palm for a moment, where the snowflakes were landing and immediately melting in the warmth of his skin. "I think I do," he said. "I think things that sound too good to be true sometimes are just true." Emma and Luke looked at each other over his head briefly, with the kind of look that married people share when a child has said something that lands in the adult world with a resonance the child does not fully know. Winter on the Kansas plains was a test of the particular kind that the plains have always applied to the people who try to live on them, relentless and indifferent. The cold not cruel but simply there, massive and present and requiring to be met with the equal and opposite force of good preparation and genuine warmth. The Maddox house had both. Emma had put up enough provisions to last the winter comfortably, and the stove was never allowed to go cold, and in the evenings the parlor fire was lit, and the family gathered around it with the ease of people who have worked out where they all belong in a shared space. Luke read. Caleb worked on his carving, which had progressed from simple shapes to small figures of animals and people that were recognizable and surprisingly detailed for the hands of a 9-year-old. Emma sewed or read alongside them, and sometimes she and Luke talked in the quiet way they had developed, not at each other, but alongside each other, the way two people talk when they are settled enough to not need to perform talking. Sometimes Caleb read aloud from his school reader, which he did with a stilted formality that gradually gave way, as the weeks went on, to the natural rhythms of a boy who is good at reading and beginning to let himself enjoy it. It was on a winter night in January, with a blizzard working itself up outside and the house holding tight against it, that Caleb placed one of his carved animals on the kitchen table beside Emma's coffee cup and left it there without saying anything. She looked at it. It was a bird, she thought, a meadowlark with its head tilted in the listening position, and something in her chest did the thing it sometimes did, the thing that had no proper name. She picked it up and held it for a moment, and then she put it on the windowsill next to the carved horse that had migrated back to the kitchen several months ago, and when Caleb came down for breakfast the next morning and saw it there, he looked at it, and then at her, and something in his face was open and simple and free of the watchfulness in a way that she thought was not unlike the very first flapjack morning, a door coming slightly further open. "It is good there," he said. "The light is good there." "The light is very good," she agreed, and put the flapjacks on the table. By the time the first genuine thaw came in March, the house had become what it had the bones to be all along, a place where people lived fully, where the rooms held the evidence of real life being lived in them, where the kitchen always smelled of something good, and the parlor had books and firelight in it, and someone was always somewhere in it making a useful sound. The photograph of me was still on the mantelpiece, and the Sunday dress was still at the back of the wardrobe, and the carved horse and the meadowlark were on the kitchen windowsill, and all of this was simply the texture of the place, all its stories, the sad ones and the glad ones together. In the spring, Emma told Luke, one morning over coffee when Caleb was already out with Jerry in the yard, that she thought she was with child. She told him directly and without dramatic preparation, which was how she told him important things, and she watched the color change in his face, something going soft and then bright and then carefully composed, the sequence of emotions moving through him too quickly to stop. He set down his coffee cup. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly certain," she said. "Not certain enough to announce it to the whole county, but certain enough to tell you." He looked at her for a moment, and then he came around the table and she rose from her chair, and he held her with the quiet strength that was, she thought, the truest expression of who he was, not demonstrative but absolutely sure, the kind of hold that says, "I have got you, and I have got you for good." "Are you happy?" he asked into her hair. "Enormously," she said. She heard him breathe out slowly. "So am I," he said. "So am I, Emma." Caleb took the news with the measured thoughtfulness she had come to expect from him, though she noticed, in the days following the announcement, that he took himself out to the woodpile rather more often than usual, which was what he did when he was processing something and needed the physical action of it. She did not press or follow him there. She let him have his thinking time, and she kept the kitchen as it always was, and she did not change anything about his food or his place at the table or the carved animals on the windowsill. A week after the announcement, he appeared in the kitchen while she was making supper and stood at the edge of the room with his hands in his pockets and said, with the care of someone who has been composing a sentence for a week and is now ready to deliver it, "I think it is good that you are going to have a baby." He paused. "I think I would like a brother, but I would also accept a sister." Emma kept her eyes on the pot and the smile that took over her face entirely out of his sight for a moment. "That is very reasonable of you," she said. "I will see what I can do." He nodded, accepting this seriously. "Also," he said, "I thought you should know. I told Jimmy Forsyth at school that you make the best biscuits in Caldwell. He said his mother's biscuits were better. I said he was wrong." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "Did you eat Jimmy Forsyth's mother's biscuits?" "Once," Caleb said. "They were acceptable. But not better. Not even close," he said with complete composure. She laughed, and he ducked his head in that way he had, with a small, reluctant smile coming out before he could stop it. And then he came into the kitchen properly and sat down at the table and opened his school reader, and the evening proceeded in the ordinary beloved way. The spring stretched into a summer that was hot but manageable, and the new eastern land was being worked, and the cattle were doing well, and the finances were tight but not frightening. And Emma was beginning to show, and moved through the house with the same efficiency she always had, slightly more deliberate and slightly more aware of her body, but not stopping. She gardened and cooked and managed the household and rode into Caldwell when necessary, and did not accept being treated like an invalid, which the women of Caldwell had a tendency to want to do, though they meant it kindly. Mrs. Paulson, who had become something approaching a friend over the course of the year, sat with Emma one afternoon at the back of the store when business was slow and said, in the frank way of a woman who does not see the point of being indirect, "You have done something remarkable with that household, Emma Maddox." "I have done nothing remarkable," Emma said. "I have cooked and kept house." "You know that is not all you have done," Mrs. Paulson said. Emma was quiet for a moment. "Caleb did the real work," she said. "He decided to let me in. That was the harder thing." "Children always do the harder thing," Mrs. Paulson said, with the air of a woman who has watched a great deal of life go past her store window. "They have to decide to trust the world again when the world has hurt them. That is the hardest thing there is." Emma thought about this on the drive home, with the summer going big and blue overhead, and the grass on either side of the road full of the meadowlarks she could identify by their calls. And she thought about Caleb at 9 with his closed face in the kitchen doorway, and his carved wooden horse on the windowsill, and the warm milk with honey that she had set on the table in the middle of the night without condition or demand, and the way the chair had scraped and he had sat down, and the way everything had turned from there. Luke was at the fence by the yard when she drove in, the same place she had first seen him, mending the same fence or one very like it, and he looked up and watched her drive in with the same careful attention he had the first time, but with everything different in the quality of it, all the guardedness gone and only the real attention remaining, the kind that sees what is there and is glad of it. She climbed down from the buckboard and he came across the yard and took her hand to steady her, which she did not need but accepted because she liked his hand. "Good day in town?" he asked. "A good day," she said. "Mrs. Paulson sends her regards." "Mrs. Paulson always sends her regards, Luke said. I think she is fundamentally good-natured underneath all the information gathering. She is very good-natured, Emma agreed, and very well informed. He looked at her with that particular warm attention and said, You look tired, come and sit on the porch. I will sit on the porch when I have put the buckboard up and started supper, she said. I will put the buckboard up, he said. You start supper and then sit. She considered whether to argue with this and decided not to, because it was an offer made from the right place, and she was, in truth, slightly tired, and there was no virtue in refusing help from a good man. Thank you, she said, and went inside. The baby came in late November of 1879, in the same bedroom that looked out over the Kansas plains on the east side of the house, during a snowfall that was light and steady and blurred the edges of everything it touched. Mrs. Paulson had organized the practical details with her customary efficiency, and the doctor from Caldwell was there, a Dr. Fielding, young and competent and recently arrived from Ohio, and Luke was downstairs with Caleb because that was how these things were done. The men relegated to the kitchen while the women's work of the world got done. Emma labored through the morning and into the afternoon, attended by Mrs. Paulson and the doctor, and she was not dramatic about it because she was not a dramatic woman, but it was hard and real and required every bit of the stubbornness that was one of her fundamental qualities. When the baby finally came, in the late afternoon with the light changing outside the window and the snow still falling, it was, as it always is, entirely itself, not what she had imagined, which was abstract, but what it actually was, which was a person specific and immediate and utterly here. A boy. Doctor. Fielding wrapped him and put him in her arms, and she looked at him. This small, very new person with his dark hair and his unfocused dark eyes and his absolute undeniable reality, and felt the particular enormity of new life in a way that took language away entirely for a moment. When Luke came up, Caleb behind him with his serious face entirely undone by something that was simple, uncomplicated wonder, Emma watched them both look at the baby, and she watched Luke's face do the thing it had done when she told him she was with child but multiplied enormously, all the containment gone and only the feeling showing, and she thought, there he is again. There is the real man. There he has always been. Luke came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby in her arms and then at her, and his hand found hers in the covers and held it. And he did not say anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed saying. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the baby with the critical assessment of a boy who has had a week of being an only child still ahead of him and is now making his first adjustment. He is very small, he said. He will get bigger, Emma said. What will you call him? Caleb asked. Emma looked at Luke. This was a conversation they had had at length, the way they had conversations that mattered slowly over time with mutual consideration. They had talked about me and about honoring the past while living in the present, and they had talked about names and what names carry, and they had arrived where they had arrived. We thought Thomas, Emma said, for your grandfather on your father's side. Caleb turned this over in his characteristic way, examining it from different angles. Thomas Maddox, he said. Thomas Maddox, Luke confirmed. That is a good name, Caleb said, with the authoritative tone of a child handing down a considered judgment. I think that is a very good name. A pause. Can I hold him? Emma looked at Luke and Luke looked at Caleb, and there was a brief adult-to-adult communication of the wordless kind, and then Emma said, Come here and sit up here with me and I will show you how. Caleb climbed up carefully and settled beside her, and she showed him how to hold his arms and she placed Thomas in them, and the baby blinked up at his half-brother with the unfocused gravity of a very new person encountering the world, and Caleb held him with a focused, serious care that was one of the most careful and tender things Emma had ever seen. Hello, Caleb said to the baby, with the same directness he brought to all important communications. I am your brother. I will look out for you. Emma pressed her lips together for a moment and blinked and looked at the snow outside the window, and Luke beside her was very still, and the room held all of them in the early winter dark, the lamp burning, the snow falling, the new person in the world figuring out what it had come to. The winter that Thomas's life began was cold but not brutal, and the house that had been remade over the course of a year and a half held against it warmly. Luke had put in a second fireplace in the room they were using as a nursery, and it was always warm there, and the baby was healthy and loud, and extremely clear about what he wanted, which struck Emma as a reasonable quality to begin a life with. She fed him and rocked him and carried him through the house in the early mornings while everyone else slept, talking to him quietly about the house and the snow and the meadowlarks that she could still sometimes hear even in winter, the stubborn ones who stayed when the others had gone. Caleb was 10 now, and had settled into a brother's role with more ease than she had dared hope for, not without adjustment. There were moments of the particular gravity that a firstborn child carries when the center of domestic attention shifts, but he moved through these moments and came out the other side each time, and returned to the table and the kitchen and the life they were all building together with the resilience that was one of his deepest qualities. Spring of 1880 came the way spring always came on the Kansas plains, not gracefully or gradually, but all at once, as though the season had been waiting just behind a curtain and had finally gotten tired of waiting. The grass came up green, and the wildflowers appeared in the ditches, and the meadowlarks returned in number, and Thomas, who was 3 months old and had discovered his own hands, treated each morning as a new and entirely interesting development. Emma planted the kitchen garden again, this time with Thomas in a basket in the shade of the porch rail, and Luke came out to help in the evenings after the day's work, and Caleb came too, and did the parts he considered suitable for a person of his age and capabilities, which was most of them. They worked in the long spring evenings with the light lasting and the smell of turned earth in the air, and the particular quality of a family that has found its shape and is comfortable in it, not without its difficulties and rough edges, but real and mutual, and built from something genuine. One evening in May, almost exactly a year after the conversation in the kitchen garden when Luke had first said what he felt, they were all on the porch at dusk, Emma in the chair with Thomas asleep on her shoulder, Luke on the steps, Caleb on the rail with his latest carving, a small horse that was the best he had done yet, and the meadowlark in the far field was doing its last singing of the day, and the sky was going those colors that only a Kansas sky goes. Colors that do not have good names in English, but that means something on the level beneath words. "I think this is the best evening we have had this year," Caleb said, with the judicious air of someone delivering a scientific finding. "It is a strong contender," Luke agreed. "It is the best," Caleb said more firmly. He held up the carved horse and looked at it in the failing light. "I am going to give this one to Thomas, when he is old enough to not put it in his mouth." "That is generous of you," Emma said. Caleb considered this. "He should have good things from the beginning," he said. "He should know what is good from the beginning, and not have to find out later." He paused, and she thought he might be saying something else underneath the obvious thing, and she was sure of it when he did not look at her and then looked at her, and then looked away again with the particular expression of a boy saying something he has thought about for a long time and has finally decided to say. "I am glad you came here," he said. "Miss Whitaker, I mean, Emma." He had not called her Emma before. He had called her Miss Whitaker, and then, with the shift of season that her marriage to Luke had created, he had not quite known what to call her and had mostly avoided the question through omission, and she had let this be, knowing it was a question that would resolve itself in its own time. "I am glad I came here too," she said, and let the simplicity of that be enough because it was. Thomas made a small sound in his sleep and resettled himself on her shoulder, and Luke looked across at her over the sleeping baby with the full warmth of a man who has been through the far country of grief and come home to something he knows the value of. And Caleb went back to his carving, and the last of the light held on the horizon for a long moment before it let go. They were in Caldwell 2 weeks later when Emma stopped at the schoolhouse to speak to Miss Holt about Caleb's progress. And while she waited in the anteroom, she looked at the drawings pinned to the wall. The children's drawings. All the slightly lopsided horses and houses and families that made up the visual language of childhood on the Kansas plains. She found Caleb's drawing easily, not because it was labeled, but because she knew his hand precise and careful and slightly more controlled than the others, the hand of a boy who takes pains with things. It was a picture of a house, and in front of the house there were 4 figures, a tall one and a medium one and a small one, and held in the medium figure's arms the smallest. Below it, in the careful block letters he had been learning, he had written, "My family." She stood in front of this drawing for a long time with Thomas in his blanket on her shoulder, and her hand resting gently on his small warm back. And the autumn air came through the propped schoolhouse door, and smelled of grass and approaching cold and the wide, honest distance of the plains. The years ahead would have their difficulties, as years do another drought summer that required careful management, a season when the cattle prices dropped and the tightness of the purse was genuine, the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of children growing up and of land that requires constant attention, and of 2 people making a life together in the daily real way rather than the romantic imagined way. There would be seasons when the work was grinding, and seasons when the land gave back everything it had taken and more. There would be evenings of genuine exhaustion and mornings of genuine joy, and all the country in between. But on this particular afternoon in the small Caldwell schoolhouse, looking at 4 block figures in front of a drawn house, and the words "My family" underneath them, Emma Whitaker Maddox felt the settled and specific happiness of a woman who has found her place in the world and knows it. Not by accident, not by luck exactly, but by the slow and consistent application of warmth and patience, and the profound belief that a good meal put on the table with care and attention was its own kind of love, and that love, properly applied, gets through. She walked out into the Caldwell afternoon with her son on her shoulder and her husband waiting by the buckboard and her stepson's voice carrying across the schoolyard as he called something to a friend. And the sky above the Kansas plains was the particular blue of a fall afternoon that holds its warmth against the coming cold. And the meadowlarks, always the meadowlarks, were singing in the last of the season's grass. Luke looked up when she came across the yard, and something in her face told him what she was feeling because he had learned to read her the way she had learned to read him, in the small true signals rather than the large performed ones. And he smiled at her, the full real smile that still had the power to change the quality of a moment completely. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Ready to go home." She handed him the baby and he settled Thomas against his shoulder with the ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. And she climbed up on the buckboard. And Caleb came running from the schoolyard and vaulted up into the back in the way of a 10-year-old who does everything at full speed. And they drove out of Caldwell and down the Kisham Road in the long fall afternoon, the 3 of them and Thomas making 4. Going home to the house that smelled of bread and fire, and all the years of good cooking laid down in its walls like warmth stored against the cold. The house where the kitchen table had 4 chairs pulled up to it now, always where the meadowlark carved from soft wood sat on the windowsill in the morning light, where the story that had begun with a 40-cent journey and a borrowed mule and a cast-iron skillet had arrived, through patience and care, and the simple transforming power of a meal made with love, at exactly where it was meant to be.